Tracker by Gary Paulson. Chapter 11. He had tracked her all that first day and all of that night, following in the moonlight and the new clean snow, and through the next morning. And when the sun was highest, his brain did not work right anymore. He was tired beyond bearing, tired beyond the dough, weaving and staggering and falling and still not stopping. By midday there was nothing for him but the dough, and the touching of the dough, and it was no longer possible to distinguish between what was real and what was not. Once in the morning light he watched the dough ahead of him, and saw her turn, and swore there was a light around her head. The light moved with her neck movements, was not a halo so much as a glow that came from within the dough, and it was still there even when he wiped his eyes. The light stayed for 5 or 6 minutes and did not disappear until the dough staggered into some willows and was lost from sight. Again later he was looking at the dough, and it seemed that everything he saw in front of him was a mirror. Seemed that the dough was actually in back of him, and that everything that was going to happen had already happened in back of him. It made his mind whirl, and then his vision fogged, and he fell down, and would have stayed down again but for the dough. She moved, and he followed. By noon she could not run, but seemed to fall forward, fall away from him, and just keep falling, with her legs catching up, only to fall again for miles and miles. And he came the same way. John was falling and making his legs catch up. He did not feel tired anymore, did not feel anything. At 1 in the afternoon he began seeing the dough all the time. She was blown out completely, and could not even make the pretense of running. Instead, she worked just to stay ahead of him, just ahead, always in sight, never more than 100 yards, often less than 50. He saw her. At one point she vomited from stress, and there was some blood in it, blood mixed with bits of bark fiber from the last time she'd eaten, over a day before. And when he came on it, he was sickened and felt the bile rise, and he too vomited. The air was warm, and he hung his jacket over a bush, stuck his cap in the back pocket, and poured sweat still. The sun was full on his back now, and he worked north, and he made sounds that weren't human, yet weren't animal, sounds from his throat as he watched her stagger and fall away from him, first to the left and then to the right. At last, when she went down, she didn't get up as fast, and then each time she fell, she was slower to get up, and he kept coming, until there came a time when he was nearly on her before she got up, only to fall again, and then she didn't get up. She was blown. Her ribs heaved for air as his did. Her eyes showed edges of red. Her mouth was open and her tongue stuck out to the side, and he thought he'd never seen anything so awful and ugly and beautiful at the same time. The dough was his, and he didn't have to kill her, give her death, and he moved forward to her, on his hands and knees now, crawling, lunging, and she jerked to get away once and fell, and he saw it as a picture. The dough on her side, heaving air, the yellow in the snow where she urinated in fear, the fear and the madness around her, the wild eyes. And he reached out, and he touched her. He was there, and his hand went out, and he touched her, and then he fell, down and down in the snow, and when he opened his eyes in a minute, an hour, a lifetime, she was gone. He got up and stood weaving, looking back on his trail. The sun was afternoon hot, and he had touched her, and she was gone. Gone. But he had done it. He knew because the yellow was still on the snow, and there were flecks of blood from her nostrils, and the imprint of her muzzle in the white. He had touched her, and now he had to get home and tell his grandfather that he had done it. He had won, and there would be life now, life taken from death, life taken back. Chapter 12. It was dark again when John reached the farm, dark and cold. He stopped in the woods on a small rise and looked at the house. He couldn't tell his grandfather what had happened, at least not all of it. He had been chewing on it since he'd left the dough, walking all day in a thought haze. She had run in great loops and circles of fear, but not a terrible distance from the farm. When he'd regained some of his thoughts, He knew where he was and took a straight line back to the rifle and from there home. A 7-hour walk. 7 hours of wondering what he would say to his grandfather, and now the time had come. He would have to say something, but he couldn't tell him of cheating death. That wouldn't work either. The doe had taught him much. Not about death, but about life. And yet it was not something he could share with anybody. It was not something he was sure he really understood himself. It was just a thing that was. A way for something to be. She made him see a new way, but he could not make others do the same. They had to have their own deer. His legs were on fire and the pain seemed worse now that he was close to home. He staggered down to the porch and leaned the rifle in the corner and stomped clear of snow and went in. They were sitting at the kitchen table, just as they always sat. Relief flooded his grandfather's face, a clearing away of wrinkles, but he said nothing. His grandmother coughed and cleared her throat, and he could see mist in the corners of her eyes, small tears. "We were worried," she said, controlling her voice. "It came on to being long, longer than you've ever been at hunting." John shook his coat off and hung it up and sat at the table, still silent. "For all that, you didn't make meat?" His grandfather lit his pipe, making clouds of smoke. He only smoked when he wanted to think before talking, he'd once told John. 2 days and some and no meat? John studied him. It's not like it was before. He trailed off, said nothing more for a long minute. What isn't what's changed? And that's it, John thought, the idea searing across the front of his mind. What has changed? Had touching the deer altered anything? Was there not still death coming to his grandfather? I found a doe and I followed her, he started, but it wasn't coming out right. For 2 days you followed a doe, and you didn't get a shot? John looked out the window and yet could see nothing but the reflected room, the tablecloth with the pattern, the glow of the lamp. It was like another world facing the world he was in, a world that was the same and yet the opposite, and he wished he were in the mirror world. A thing changed, John said. A thing changed in hunting, in everything, and I walked after her, but didn't shoot her. His grandparents said nothing, waited. And I walked for 2 days, and then I touched her. Actually, 2 days and a night. And when I touched her, everything changed. Everything about the way we are and what's happening. He finished lamely, letting it simply end. His grandmother took a plate of meat and potatoes from the oven and put it in front of him. She had known somehow that he was coming because it wasn't stale food, still fresh. Or maybe she'd just kept a different plate warm each night. No, he thought. She'd known somehow, just as she always knows. His grandfather put his pipe down. He never smoked when anybody was eating. He looked at John, then out the window. You touched her? You really touched a live deer? John nodded. I walked and touched her. She couldn't get up. Another long pause. Ain't that something, Aggie? His grandfather said. He walked one down. Ain't that something? And there was a thing in his voice that John had never heard before. A touch of pride, perhaps. A building of something. I'll take that with me, his grandfather went on. That's something I'll just take with me. John had a forkful of meat halfway to his mouth, and he stopped, put the fork down. He was surprised to see that his grandfather was crying. Crying as he looked at his reflection in the window, or just looked out the window. And 2 thoughts cut through the tiredness in his mind, burned into his brain. The first was that his grandfather was going to die. He would die, and there was nothing John could do about it. Nothing touching the doe could do about it. Death would come. And the second thing was that death was a part of it all, a part of living. It was awful, a taking of life, but it happened to all things, as his grandfather said, would happen to John someday. Dying was just as much a part of Claiborne as living. Tomorrow I do the chores, John said. You take it easy. After that, there was just the food and keeping his eyes open until he went up the stairs to bed, where he dreamt of the doe and his grandfather, and awakened in sweat when the dream became too real. But he made no sound and went back to sleep evenly. Even thoughts of the doe washed from his mind.